The first time Dren Kesh saved a life on Coraline-B, he almost didn't, and the woman bleeding out on his fence line would spend the next 4 days making sure he never forgot how close that hesitation came to killing them both. He lived on Outpost Var 9, a research post on the ashfields of Coraline-B, cataloging mineral veins for a mining consortium that had stopped sending resupply ships 18 months ago and stopped answering hails 11 months after that. He was not stranded by accident. He had requested the posting himself after a tribunal on his home colony found him guilty of nothing provable and everything suspected: the deaths of 3 men on a drilling rig, all ruled equipment failure, all men who had cheated him first. Dren was capable of violence. He had never denied it to himself. He simply preferred silence to consequence, and Coraline-B gave him 300 kilometers of dead orange rock and not one other living voice to complicate that preference. He had built a routine out of that silence the way other men build a marriage. Wake before the twin suns cleared the ash ridge, the light coming up the color of a bruise, run the seismic sweep, log the mineral cores by hand because the automated logger had failed in year 2 and he'd never requisitioned a replacement. Eat alone, sleep alone, speak to no one but the outpost's aging AI, which had long since stopped asking him how he was doing because his answers never varied. He told himself he preferred it that way. Most days, in the particular hour before sleep when the walls ticked as they cooled, he almost believed it. That silence ended on the 9th day of his 4th year, when the automated perimeter drone sent an alert he hadn't heard in so long the tone itself felt foreign. Something scraped up from a life he barely remembered living. He found her at the boundary fence, wrists lashed to a signal relay post with cord that wasn't rope, a bioluminescent fiber that pulsed faintly with each labored breath she took, tightening rather than loosening the longer she strained against it, as though it were feeding on the effort. She was Ythari, one of the long-limbed violet-skinned people from the orbital habitats above Coraline-B, a species Dren had only ever seen in consortium propaganda reels warning colonists about sabotage and infiltration. Her flight suit was torn at the shoulder, the wound beneath it cauterized black at the edges by something that wasn't a blade, an energy weapon, maybe, or a discipline tool the compact used on its own. Blood the color of rust-dark wine had dried down her forearm in a thin, cracked ribbon and dripped into the ash below her, and for one long moment Dren simply stood there, rifle raised, the barrel not quite steady, deciding whether saving her was worth what it might cost him. He had learned on the drilling rig that rescuing people rarely came free. She lifted her head before he decided anything for her. Her eyes, pale gold, vertical pupiled, entirely without fear, fixed on the rifle, and her voice came out cracked but level. If he meant to shoot her, he should get on with it, because she'd rather die by a stranger's hand than wait for the ones who'd tied her here to come back and finish the job properly. That was the first thing she ever said to him. Not a plea, a dare, offered with what was left of her strength like she had nothing else worth spending it on. He cut her down anyway. Not from mercy, he told himself, but because a dead alien on his fence line meant questions he didn't want to answer if anyone ever came looking. She didn't thank him. She cataloged him instead, the way he might catalog a rock sample: his rifle, his stance, the scar along his jaw, the 4-year sunburn that had settled permanently into his skin. Only then did she offer that her name was Ythari, that she was a courier scout for the Ythari compact, and that the people who'd staked her to his fence were her own kin, a faction who considered her a traitor, for reasons she did not intend to share with a colonist she'd known for 4 minutes. Dren didn't share his own reasons for anything either. Fair trade, he supposed. Neither of them owed the other a confession. He brought her inside the outpost only because leaving her outside meant leaving evidence outside, and he stitched the wound on her shoulder with a field kit that hadn't been opened in 3 years, its seal cracking like old paint when he broke it. He worked in silence while she watched his hands the entire time, not with gratitude but with the flat attention of someone deciding whether those hands would be useful or dangerous to her later. When he finished, she rolled the shoulder once, testing it, wincing only at the very edge of the motion, and said his stitches were competent. For a man who'd clearly learned surgery from closing wounds he'd caused rather than ones he'd treated, He didn't answer that. She wasn't wrong, and they both knew it. For 3 days they orbited each other inside the outpost cramped modules like two magnets forced together by a hand that refused to let go, each pretending not to watch the other, each absolutely watching. Dren kept his rifle within reach at all times, even at meals, even asleep, propped against the wall like a third presence in the room. Sail kept a small bone-white blade sheathed against her thigh, one he'd noticed on the second day, and she'd made no effort to hide once she realized he'd seen it, as if the honesty of the weapon was itself a kind of courtesy, a warning offered instead of a lie. Neither commented on the other's readiness. It was simply understood, a rule laid down without a single word exchanged, that this alliance, if it could even be called that, was temporary, provisional, and entirely without trust. On the second night, over the low hum of the air recyclers, she asked him without preamble why a man capable of stitching a stranger's wound with that much precision chose to live somewhere no one would ever need stitching done. Dren said the ashfields didn't ask questions. She said neither did corpses, and that wasn't the same as peace. He didn't answer that either. He was beginning to notice that her silences cut sharper than her words, and that unsettled him more than anything she'd said outright. Then the sky above Coraline-B lit up green, bleeding light down through the ash haze like something torn open, and the outpost warning klaxon screamed for the first time in Dren's 4 years of silence. The Ythari faction that had staked sail to the fence hadn't left the system. They'd been waiting in high orbit, patient in a way that told Dren they'd expected her to run somewhere exactly like this, and now their dropships were descending, not toward the habitats above, but toward Var 9 itself, toward the one place their trader had run to ground. Went pale beneath her violet skin, the first crack of genuine fear Dren had seen from her, and she said, low and fast, that if those ships landed and found her here, they would kill him too, simply for the crime of having touched her wound. Dren didn't ask what she'd done to earn that kind of hunt. There wasn't time, and some part of him suspected he wouldn't like the answer. He grabbed the rifle instead and asked her, flat, no warmth in it, whether she intended to be useful to him or just be the reason he died. She said she intended to survive, same as him, and that survival for the next several hours apparently required they not kill each other first. The dropships breached the outpost's outer perimeter within the hour, and the two of them were forced into the kind of cooperation neither wanted, Dren sealing blast doors with codes he hadn't used since installation, his fingers stumbling twice over sequences that used to be reflex. Sail disabling the tracking beacon woven into her own flight suit, with the same bone blade she'd have used on him under different circumstances, both of them working the outpost's ancient defense grid like two strangers playing a duet on an instrument neither fully understood. When the first boarding team cut through the eastern airlock in a shriek of superheated metal, it was Sail's knowledge of Ythari boarding protocol that told them exactly where the strike team would breach next, and it was Dren's rifle that put down the first two through the gap before they'd fully cleared the threshold, the reports flat and enormous in the metal corridor. They didn't celebrate, they didn't even look at each other. They simply reloaded and waited, and each privately recalculated what the other was worth alive. The second breach came from a direction neither of them had covered, a maintenance shaft Dren had forgotten even existed, sealed since before his posting began. 2 soldiers dropped through it into the habitation model, and for 3 brutal seconds it was only Sail between them and the corridor that led to Dren's back. She didn't call for help. She simply moved blade first, closing the distance with a speed that startled him even in the middle of his own fight, using her longer reach the way Dren used range, and when it was over she stood breathing hard with someone else's blood across her knuckles and an expression that dared him to comment on it. He didn't. He'd have done the same, and they both knew that too. The demolition charge one of the fallen soldiers had been carrying detonated moments later, whether by design or by accident neither of them ever agreed on, and the blast tore a meter-wide gash through the outer wall of the habitation module, ash and grit howling in through the breach on a wind that hadn't existed a second before. The alarms changed pitch this time, not intrusion now, but decompression. Coraline-B's atmosphere was thin and laced with ash particulate fine enough to shred lung tissue in under 2 minutes, and the outpost had exactly one functioning emergency respirator mask left in its stores. The other three, lost to years of neglect, Dren had never bothered to fix because he'd never expected to need them. He found it first. He held it in his hand for one long second, looking at Sael across the ash-choked room, her outline already softening in the swirling gray, and understood that this was the first real test of everything they'd said to each other, every cold admission that neither owed the other survival. She saw him hesitate and didn't beg. She simply said, voice already thinning from the bad air, that if he kept it for himself she wouldn't blame him, because she'd have run the same calculation in his boots. But that a dead Ythari courier was worth exactly nothing to whatever consortium contact he was hoping to sell her to, while a living one, indebted for her heir, might be worth considerably more. It wasn't gratitude she was offering. It was a trade, laid out plainly even as her vision swam and her knees started to fold. Dren shoved the mask into her hands anyway, and when she moved to press it back toward him instead, he told her flat that they didn't have time to be noble about it, that the patch kit was closer to him than it was to her, and that this pointedly was not forgiveness, just arithmetic. He sealed the breach himself, choking on ash-laced air for 90 seconds that felt considerably longer, his eyes streaming, his throat closing around each grating breath, while she stood over him with the mask on and, for reasons neither of them examined afterward, didn't leave. When his vision finally cleared and the patch held, he found her still watching him, mask lowered now that the air had stabilized, an expression on her face he couldn't quite name, not gratitude. She'd made it clear she didn't deal in that currency, but something adjacent to it, something that looked almost like recalibration. She told him quietly that she'd expected him to keep the mask. Every colonist she'd ever crossed paths with had made the same calculation, eventually, sooner or later, dressed up in different justifications. He said he wasn't interested in being every colonist she'd ever met. She said that remained to be proven, and they left it there, because neither of them trusted a truce built on a single act of decency to survive contact with the next crisis. Have you ever wondered how quickly trust reorganizes itself when survival is the only currency left? Before we go further, if you're watching this alone in the dark the way I suspect a few of you are, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is there right now. I read every one of them, and it always surprises me how far this channel travels while you're all asleep, or awake, or somewhere in between. Now, back to VAR 9 because it's about to get considerably worse for both of them, because that's what happened next. In the crawl space beneath the outpost's collapsed east wing, when the third wave came through and Dren took a plasma graze across the ribs that dropped him to one knee, the pain arriving a half-second after the smell of his own burned jacket did, and Sael, who could have simply left him there, who had every tactical reason to abandon a wounded colonist and vanish into the ash while the boarders were distracted, instead planted herself over him and put 3 rounds from his own spare sidearm into the 2 Ythari soldiers who came through the gap first. She didn't do it gently. She did it the way a professional does something distasteful but necessary, her expression unreadable. And when it was done, she hauled him up by the collar and told him, without softness, that she needed him breathing a while longer, because dead colonists couldn't finish sealing the last 3 doors between them and the reactor core. Dren, breathing hard, blood slicking his side in a warmth he could feel, spreading even through the pain, said that was, without question, the least romantic thing anyone had ever said while saving his life. Sael said she wasn't saving his life, she was extending her own. He believed her. That was the strange part. He believed her more for the honesty of it than he'd have believed any lie about gratitude. A lie would have cost her nothing. The truth cost her the comfort of pretending she was anything other than exactly as calculating as he was, and she'd paid it anyway, without flinching. The next hour peeled back more of who they both were than either intended, cornered in the reactor control room, waiting for the next wave. The emergency lighting throwing everything the color of old rust, Sael finally admitted, not because she trusted him, but because the silence had become heavier than the confession. That she wasn't merely a courier caught in a factional dispute. She'd stolen something from the Compact's ruling council before she fled, a data core containing coordinates to a resource the council had been hiding from every outer colony, including Coraline-B. For 6 years, a vein of raw stasis crystal beneath the ashfields, valuable enough to fund a war or end one depending on who found it first. The soldiers hunting her weren't chasing a traitor. They were chasing the only proof that the council had been lying to everyone, including their own people, about what was really beneath the ground. Dren had spent 4 years quietly mining around without ever knowing what he was standing on. Dren absorbed that with the same flat calculation he gave everything, though something behind his eyes went very still. He asked evenly what she intended to do with coordinates like that once she was off this rock. She said she hadn't decided yet whether to sell them, weaponize them, or destroy them, and that whichever she chose it would not include him, because sentiment was a luxury neither of them could afford, and she doubted very much he'd extend her the same courtesy if their positions were reversed. She was right, he wouldn't have. He told her so, plainly, and something in her expression, not warmth, never warmth, but a kind of grim respect, settled into place like a bone sliding back into its socket. That was when he told her his own truth, the one he hadn't spoken aloud in 4 years, that he hadn't come to Coraline-B to study minerals. He'd come because the tribunal that let him walk free had also quietly suggested he disappear somewhere no one would look too closely, and that if she was carrying proof the Compact Council had been lying to outer colonies. There were people back on his homeworld, the same consortium that had abandoned this outpost, who would pay enormous sums to bury that proof forever, rather than let it surface and destabilize the mining contracts they held with the very council Sale had betrayed. In other words, they were each, in their own way, exactly the kind of person who would sell the other out the moment it became profitable. Neither flinched from saying it aloud. That honesty, brutal as it was, became the only thing holding their alliance together. Not trust, but the absence of pretending trust existed at all. Sale said, almost thoughtfully, that this was the strangest kind of safety she'd ever felt. Not being believed, but being fully understood, threat and all. Dren didn't disagree. It was, he realized, the first conversation he'd had in 4 years that didn't require him to perform anything for anyone. The next wave hit as the reactor's containment field flickered, damaged by an earlier demolition charge, and the outpost ancient AI announced, in a voice gone thin and stuttering with age, that structural failure was imminent within the hour. Sale moved to the core controls with practiced hands that didn't shake even now, stabilizing what she could, and admitted, grudging, precise, that compact engineering ran through her blood the way survival instinct ran through his, and that between the two of them they might buy the reactor another day, if the last wave of boarders didn't kill them first. It was during that repair that the outpost AI flagged a second signal, one neither of them had triggered, a narrow beam transmission originating from Sale's own gear, active despite her earlier sabotage. She went rigid, her hands stopping mid-motion over the console. It wasn't a tracking beacon. It was a dead man's relay, keyed to her heartbeat, that would broadcast the data core's coordinates to the Compact Council automatically the moment her vital signs flatlined. Insurance, she admitted. Installed by allies she no longer entirely trusted, to make sure her death wouldn't bury the truth with her. Dren asked, carefully, what happened if he was the one who ended up killing her? She said the coordinates would broadcast anyway, and the consortium he so badly wanted to sell her out to would get exactly what they wanted for free, with her dead and unable to negotiate terms for either of them. It was, he realized, the closest thing to a peace treaty either of them had offered the other. Not trust, just mutual ruin if either one tried anything clever. They didn't. Dren and Sale met the final assault in the narrow corridor outside the core room, back to back for the first time. Not out of affection but geometry. The only configuration that let them both fire without exposing the other's flank. It was, Dren thought distantly as he emptied his second magazine, ears ringing, the closest thing to intimacy either of them had offered the other. A mutual, unspoken agreement not to let the enemy kill the only other person capable of keeping them both alive 5 minutes longer. When the last boarder fell, the corridor went silent except for the reactor's dying hum and their own ragged breathing, loud in the sudden absence of gunfire. Sale turned first. She had the data core in her hand. She'd retrieved it from her flight suit's hidden lining sometime during the fight, Dren realized, without him ever noticing the theft in reverse. She held it up, studied him across the wreckage of dead soldiers and scorched metal, and said this was the moment, wasn't it? The moment where he decided whether to take it from her by force, hand her over to whatever consortium contacts still owed him a favor, buy his way back into a life he clearly hadn't wanted badly enough to keep in the first place. Dren looked at the core, small and unremarkable in her palm, for something that had already gotten so many people killed. He thought about the tribunal, the men on the rig, the 4 years of silence he'd chosen because silence never asked him to justify himself. He thought about what it would cost him to take it, and what it would cost him to walk away. He thought, too, about the dead man's relay, and understood that taking it by force meant killing her, and killing her meant handing the consortium everything for nothing. No leverage, no favor owed, just blood on a floor he'd have to clean himself, alone, the way he'd cleaned up every other mess in his life. He told her the truth because lies had stopped being useful between them somewhere around the second firefight, that he didn't want her data, and he didn't want her gratitude, and he especially didn't want whatever fragile thing was trying to grow in the wreckage between two people who had every reason to put a knife in each other the second it became convenient. What he wanted was for her to leave, take her proof, burn her counsel down, or sell it to the highest bidder. He genuinely didn't care which, so long as she did it somewhere that wasn't his fence line, because he had spent 4 years building a silence he intended to keep. Sale studied him a long moment, gold eyes unreadable in the dim emergency light, and said that was, without question, the least sentimental way anyone had ever declined to be a hero. He said he wasn't a hero. He'd simply run the numbers, and keeping her alive a while longer had cost him less than the alternative, nothing more. She almost smiled at that, the first expression on her face that wasn't calculation. She said that the numbers had run the same way for her, more or less, and that she supposed that made them equals in the only currency that mattered out here. She added, quieter, that equals was more than most alliances managed. In her experience, usually one side ended up owing the other, and owing always curdled eventually into resentment or worse. Better, she said, to walk away even. Before she left, she did one more thing neither of them had negotiated for. She set the mask she'd worn during the decompression down on the console between them, the one he'd given her without asking for anything back, and said that keeping it would have made this a story about a debt owed, and she didn't want to owe him a story. She wanted to owe him nothing at all, cleanly. The way two dangerous people were supposed to part when neither one had lied to the other about what they were. She left before dawn, taking one of the outpost's aging shuttles without asking permission, because asking would have implied she needed it, and she didn't operate that way. Before the hatch sealed, she paused just long enough to tell him that if their paths crossed again, she couldn't promise which side of the numbers she'd land on, and neither, she suspected, could he. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a promise either. It was simply the truth offered the same way everything else between them had been offered, without softening. Dren watched her ascent trail burn orange against the gray sky until it thinned to nothing and felt nothing he could easily name. Not relief, not loss, something colder and more honest than either. He never learned what she did with the coordinates. He never tried to find out. Some debts, he decided, were better left unpaid on both sides, because a debt paid was a bond formed, and neither of them had signed up for bonds. He went back to cataloging minerals the next morning, in a silence that was, for the first time in 4 years, not entirely comfortable, and he told himself that was fine. Not every alliance needs to end in warmth to have meant something. Sometimes surviving each other is the only honesty two people can afford, and sometimes that has to be enough. He caught himself, weeks later, checking the northern horizon before he logged the seismic sweep. The way a man checks a door he's not sure he locked. He never admitted to himself exactly what he was watching for. He told himself it was habit, the residue of a siege, nothing more, the kind of vigilance any survivor carries afterward, whether they want to or not. He didn't examine too closely why the habit felt less like fear and more like waiting. if this story made you sit with that discomfort a little longer than you expected, if you found yourself unsure right up to the end whether either of them deserved the other's trust, that's the story doing exactly what it set out to do. Not every alliance is meant to heal. Some are only meant to hold just long enough before both sides walk away intact. And there's a strange kind of dignity in that, two dangerous people choosing not to destroy each other, not out of love but out of respect for a threat well matched. If you want more stories like this one, hard-edged, morally unresolved, built on tension instead of comfort, subscribe to Xeno Fantasy, and I'll see you in the next one.